for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and I'm very excited today to host Dr. Stephen Freeze for a discussion and essentially U.S. rollout of his new book, Transforming Energy Systems, Economics, Policies, and Change. Stephen examines market developments, policies that advance and guide innovation and deployment of low-carbon alternatives to fossil fuel use. He makes a compelling case for heterodox energy reform strategies, which he's going to set out for us today, including market-creating industrial policies sequenced with emissions pricing differentiated by sector. Stephen, I want to stress, is, to my mind, one of the leading practical policy economists working on climate change and decarbonization, having done both research and policy work, as well as being a leader in the business of energy as well. He is currently a senior associate fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford University. Previously, he was chief economist at Shell and at the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change. He has also previously served in a number of roles at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, including as deputy chief economist and director of research. We've been privileged to work with Stephen for a long time in all of these roles at the EBRD, twice at Shell, and at DEC, the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK. He has also led economic analysis in government in terms of this designing energy and climate reforms. So that is why, and I wish I was holding up the book, Transforming Energy Systems, Economics, Policies, and Change is well worth today's discussion and well worth your read. I'm also delighted to announce that Stephen will be joining the Peterson Institute as a non-resident senior fellow in the coming weeks. Stephen, could you please take us through the most critical issue of our day and how to actually get the energy systems changed?
Well, thanks so much, Adam, for the very kind introduction and for hosting this talk. And also, before I turn to the book, I just want to say how honored and delighted I am to be joining the Peterson Institute as a non-resident senior fellow. As you say, I've had the enormous benefit of engaging with you and your colleagues over many years in several different roles, and the engagements have always been very thought-provoking, very informative, very beneficial, and absolutely delighted to be carrying on those engagements, albeit in a different way going forward. So thanks so much for that opportunity. Now let me turn to the book, and let me begin with a bit of context. The book essentially aims to do two things. The first is to take stock of the rapidly accumulating body of evidence on transforming energy systems. As I think folks will be increasingly aware that over the past 2 decades, we've seen a significant acceleration in the pace of advance of low carbon alternatives to fossil fuels, such as wind, solar PV, battery electric vehicles. But of course, the pace of change isn't yet sufficiently strong to reach climate goals, but it's nevertheless important to learn lessons from this experience. And so the second aim of the book is to bring out and distill the key policy lessons that can be learned from the experience that's been accumulated so far. And so the book concludes with the case for heterodox reforms, and I'll take you through what heterodox energy reforms, and I'll take you through what that means in more detail as I go through the talk. But this is essentially an exercise in acting, learning, and improving in policies or in business or commercial approaches. And so that's the context for the book. Now, let me just turn to setting out some of the context for transforming energy systems and the societal goals around climate change and energy. since the Paris Agreement on the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, the concept of net zero emissions has been increasingly in focus for both policymakers and businesses. And this concept of net zero emissions as a necessary condition for stabilizing the climate at any given level of temperature change essentially has its roots in climate science and Earth systems modeling. And these models essentially tell us that projected average temperature change, average surface temperature change, is approximately proportionate to cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide, once taking into account the effects of other greenhouse gas emissions as well. And that in order to stabilize the climate, it's and to limit temperature change at 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, it's necessary to act very decisively and to achieve a halt to emissions, to stop cumulative emissions and stabilize the climate by around mid-century, assuming a linear decline in emissions from the start of this decade. To the extent that that's backloaded, then the timetable comes forward. The other framing points that I want to make about transforming energy is the status quo and what we need to get to. So obviously our current energy system is heavily dominated by thermal technologies and fossil resources. We mostly burn fossil fuels to derive the energy services and materials we need from energy. And the capital stock that produces these services from energy consists on the supply side of the technology to extract the primary resources and to turn it into useful energy carriers like electricity and fuels. And on the energy using side, it consists of energy conversion technologies, transport vehicles, buildings, industrial plants, to turn those useful energy carriers into useful services, materials, and so forth. And the one point that I want to make about the starting point for the transformation of energy systems is that the capital stock by value of end-use technologies is about an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 larger by value than the supply side of the energy system. So what do we need to get to in terms of decarbonization of energy? Well, low carbon energy systems would mostly use renewable resources, wind, solar, hydro, as well as some nuclear resources in all likelihood. And those primary energy sources are most efficiently converted into electricity. So there would be a strong focus on electrification of many energy end uses. And indeed, that's what we're seeing with for example, with battery electric vehicles at the moment. And there would also be a requirement for low carbon fuels like hydrogen or biofuels or indeed synthetic fuels, and an adaptation of end use technologies to these low carbon fuels. And to tackle those residual emissions that couldn't be otherwise mitigated, we'd need some carbon management technologies like nature-based solutions or carbon capture and storage. Now, how to orchestrate this really pervasive change in the capital stock? Well, the stock answer in economics is that you need markets to really incentivize and guide the change. And indeed, given the scale and the pervasiveness of the change that's required, I think getting markets to do the job and to do the job as quickly as possible is the route to the quickest transformation of the capital stock. But of course, there are two impediments in the way. Most obviously is the climate externality and the fact that it's not appropriately reflected in prices in the economy and the need for emissions pricing, as well as the significant and well-evidenced knowledge spillovers from innovation in general and the role of government policy supports for R&D and innovation activities. And the book goes through the evidence on the importance of these elements, but it's also important to recognize that this is only part of the story. It's an incomplete narrative about what it takes to transform energy systems. And so the book essentially adds three key missing elements to this standard economics narrative. The first is that there's significant dynamic external economies in transforming energy systems. And I'll say a bit more about that. But the key point here is that just as there are knowledge spillovers in innovation, there are significant cost spillovers, particularly in the early stages of transforming energy systems. And the policy framework needs to take that into account. The second additional factor that the book brings into play is the importance of distributional impacts of change in energy, and in particular, how these distributional impacts can play into the risk of time inconsistent policies, particularly with respect to emissions pricing, and the imperative of crafting credible and coherent energy reform strategies. And the third point that the book develops is the importance of adapting energy market institutions and infrastructures to low carbon alternatives. And it's important to recognize that the institutional underpinnings, a bit like in the financial sector, are also quite important to how energy markets function, in addition to the important role of infrastructures. And so the key point of the key premise of the book is that the two policy fixes paradigm alone is insufficient or insufficiently strong to advance low carbon alternatives, certainly at the pace that's required. And so the book develops a heterodox approach to change. And what do I mean by that? Well, the traditional elements of R&D support and emission pricing are part of the framework, but to that, indeed, I think the experience in transforming energy systems so far points to the critical role of market creating policies for low carbon alternatives. And it's also important to begin thinking about how you can begin to anchor long run expectations to guide investment decisions, whether they're upfront investment decisions in innovation and market creation for alternatives, or indeed scaling out and deploying alternative components to the capital stock. And what we've seen in the recent period is the importance of policy commitments or anchoring concepts such as net zero emissions as a more powerful anchor than perhaps previous attempts at committing to emission pricing pathways have been. And it creates a clearer expectation of the direction of travel and transformation that's required. And of course, these upfront policies around R&D supports market creation, support for market creation for low carbon alternatives, as well as increasingly credible guides for long-run anchors of expectations, help to direct investments in innovation and market creation, private investments in market creation and innovation for low carbon alternatives. And the book then advocates the important role of goal-consistent emission pricing to essentially complete the journey to the climate goals and the transformation of the capital stock that is required. And so here, in a sense, emission pricing follows the initial advance of low carbon alternatives rather than preceding it and providing the early signal for innovation in this direction. Now, let me turn to the evidence around each of these elements of the story. And of course, let me begin with knowledge spillovers. And in a way, I think this is the least controversial aspect of the problem that society confronts. In the economics of innovation, there is a very robust result is that the social returns to investment in innovation, that the social returns to investment in R&D are are significantly above those of private returns, and that this robust result across countries, across different sectors of economies, is taken as evidence of spillovers, knowledge spillovers from innovation efforts. And we're increasingly seeing evidence from the advance of low carbon alternatives like wind, solar, battery electric vehicles, that there are similar knowledge spillovers from innovation in this direction as well. Indeed, there is evidence around using quality adjusted low carbon forward patent citations as an indication of knowledge spillovers, and the evidence being accumulated around these low carbon technologies suggests that these forward patents are similar in scope to those for ICT technologies, and another technology field which is seen as having very high degrees of knowledge spillover. And it's also, as with patenting and innovation in general, it's typically a select group of highly cited patents that account for most of the forward citations on low carbon technologies. And so they're this notion of breakthrough technologies and then cumulative progress that builds on that. And of course, this is evidence of the cumulative and path-dependent nature of technologies, of knowledge about technologies. And of this notion of this view of the knowledge about technologies dates back to the work of Nelson and Winter on kind of the evolutionary process of economic change. And indeed, we see this playing out very clearly in the current wave of technologies around low carbon innovation. And indeed, we see there's an increasing a body of evidence which shows that firms are more likely to engage in low carbon innovation if they've been engaged in previous related innovations. So the notion of technology adjacencies here is seen as evidence and in evidence and importance and also being exposed to low carbon innovations in home markets is also at a firm level likely to increase innovation in low carbon patenting activity. And these effects are seen for a range of technologies around electric drivetrains or alternative drivetrains, renewable generation, and energy storage. So that's some of the evidence around knowledge spillovers. And now let me turn to the points around cost spillovers, and particularly early cost spillovers in transforming energy systems. And let me pick up on the notion of dynamic external economies. And this is the notion that early movers in disrupting incumbent technologies, early movers being both the producers and early adopters of new technologies, that they create intangible assets that benefit followers, and that these intangible assets, the creation or the addition of these intangible assets, decline with deployment and scale. And these, in a sense, these cost spillovers can arise on both the selling side, the product side, in terms of selling externalities and market creation, as well as on the production side from better skill pools and supply chains that help all firms in a growing sector develop. And these are some of the natures of cost spillovers. And it's all external cost spillovers that on which there is evidence of their importance and significance. And it's also important to recognize that in energy systems, shared infrastructures are also central to keeping costs low, and that these infrastructures must adapt to low carbon. So let me give a simple intuitive illustration of some of these cost spillovers at work. Now, there's been a well-established notion in economics that both kind of scale economies of incumbent technologies and their related infrastructure can create lock-in effects of the incumbent technologies and make it difficult to switch to alternatives. And it's possible for, I think, to intuitively see the notion of high switching costs, for example, in early adopters of electric vehicles. The early adopters of electric vehicles not only face relatively high costs, unit costs of these vehicles, but also experience less utility from them because the supporting infrastructure in terms of refueling or recharging is not suited to these technologies. And so the utilities of the vehicles, the value of the vehicles tend to be less than the incumbent technologies. And indeed, we've seen the role of early policy supports for the purchase of EVs and investments in initial charging infrastructure, at least in some countries, that have helped overcome some of these early switching costs, both on the vehicle side, the vehicle switching side, and on the switching of the supporting infrastructure. But you can imagine that as this process rolls forward and as the composition of the vehicle fleet changes, these switching costs will decline as the supporting infrastructure is built out and demand for alternative energy for the vehicle fleet improves. And ultimately, the costs of not switching will rise and can be expected to rise and lock out what are now the incumbent technologies. And so that's a simple illustration of the dynamic external economies and cost spillovers that can affect the advance of low carbon alternatives. Now, let me then just turn to the incentives for the upfront investments in innovation and market creation. Of course, the market returns to innovation can come from through different channels. And one source of market returns to upfront investments in innovation and market creation come from the ability to differentiate end products. And the classic example, or a clear example here, is the ability for automobile producers to differentiate automobiles and attract, in this case, to essentially install relatively expensive electric drivetrains in premium automobiles in order to attract early adopters to alternative drivetrain technologies. And this was, for example, the Tesla strategy that is increasingly being followed by German automobile manufacturers and indeed other American manufacturers. And this is, I would argue, a relatively high-powered incentive for these upfront investments, because in a way, the returns to innovation are much more under the control of the firm doing the innovation. In more in markets which are less amenable to product differentiation, such as commodity markets for electric power and arguably for fuels, the ability to differentiate the end product is less, and the returns to upfront investments in innovation and market creation are, I would argue, are less powered to the extent that these returns are much more dependent on government policy and exposed to risks of policy, potential time inconsistencies in policy. So I think we're seeing a difference in the extent to which different sectors in the economy reward these upfront investments. And then, of course, to complement or to these market-based returns, there are public policies supporting R&D and private, either direct public spending on R&D or private R&D supported by tax credits, and that are directed towards low carbon alternatives by the broader policy framework and profit opportunities in markets. And the other support for these upfront investments has come through the market creating policies. I gave the example of EV purchase subsidies in the previous slide, but also the market creating supports in the forms of feed-in tariffs for renewables have also played a central role in advancing these technologies. Now, the final point that I want to make on the advance of low carbon technologies is around who are the early movers and the important role that country specialization and comparative advantage play in transforming energy systems. Now, if we look first on the innovation side, countries that specialize, we've seen very clear evidence that countries that specialize in innovation in general are also the countries that specialize in low carbon technologies, wind, solar, PV, alternative drivetrains, energy efficiency, and so forth. And indeed, 5 countries, Japan, the United States, Germany, and increasingly South Korea and China, account for approximately 80% of internationally cited low carbon patents over the past several decades. And indeed, these are countries that are relatively specialized in innovation in general. And the second point that I want to make is on the manufacturing side of this, and to make the point that the transformation of energy systems is largely involves the substitution of capital equipment for fossil resources in the ground. And so the importance of specialization in manufacturing is coming increasingly is an important aspect of transforming energy systems. And what we've seen is the countries that are relatively specialized in manufacturing as well as in innovation are also those that have created the early market creating supports for the early deployment of technologies such as onshore and offshore wind and solar PV. And these market creating policies have entailed a very substantial real resource cost. It's expensive to change, though the endpoint to which we're changing isn't necessarily more costly. But it's very clear that the transformation process itself is very costly, and that the market creating, that the supports for the real resource costs of advancing wind and solar PV to the point that they are, we anticipate them to be by the middle of this decade, has cost about 2 trillion in real resource costs. And you then have to ask the question, well, which countries have an incentive to shoulder a significant proportion of these upfront costs? And here there seems to be perhaps an association between those countries that have manufacturing capabilities or bids to develop these manufacturing capabilities and these supports. And I argue in the book that this is in part an attempt to tap into home country effects, that domestic demands can help foster the development of domestic industry. So that's a bit on the political economy. Now let me turn to around innovation. Now let me turn to a few points around emission pricing, its impacts, and what are the critical thresholds that it needs to reach to advance the transformation of energy systems. So of course, economy-wide emissions pricing sets the marginal cost of emission. It's intended to raise the relative price of emission-intensive goods and services, reduce their demands, profitability, and capacity in these sectors. I think that's all very clear. It also has, but it's also important to recognize that emission pricing, or its regulatory equivalents, has significant regressive distributional impacts. We know from household expenditure studies that that low-income household budgets tend to have relatively high expenditure shares on emission-intensive goods and services, home heating, personal transport and so forth. And on the supply side of the energy system, it's also important to realize that there are significant distributional impacts from change, and ones that we know from previous experience of structural change in energy is around the difficulty that coal mining communities have faced in recovering and regaining or recreating new economic opportunities after their traditional sources of livelihoods have ceased. And this body of evidence relates to experiences from the UK and the US, where coal mining communities have been affected by the loss of competitiveness of local resources. And the other framing point that I want to make around emissions pricing is that the shadow cost of binding future net zero emission constraints varies quite widely across sectors. We now know from the experiences over the past decade that there are going to be some, in the long run, some sectors of the economy that are going to be relatively easy to decarbonize with the technological progress that we've seen and that is reasonably forecastable. So much of power, surface transport, and energy use in buildings is amenable to, in the long run, relatively low-cost solutions, be it renewables, electrification of drivetrains and vehicles, heat pumps in buildings, and so forth, provided the buildings are adequately insulated. But they're likely to be relatively hard to decarbonize sectors that will, and they'll largely be hard to decarbonize because they will require low carbon fuels, which are likely to be inherently more expensive than the traditional fossil fuels that they replace, or they will require carbon management solutions that won't necessarily add cost to production. And so the capital stock that produces and uses energy is very heterogeneous, and there is a significant, in a sense, inframarginal part of the transformation. But indeed, some sectors of the activity will be relatively expensive to decarbonize, at least based on what we know so far. Now, there are two ways that you see in the literature to calibrate emissions pricing. The simplest and most straightforward is to take a quantitative emission goal. In the UK, it was carbon budgets for many years, but these are now the form of the quantitative climate goals are increasingly taking the form of net zero emission constraints by 2040, 2050, and developing countries in 2060 and so forth. And that these net zero emission constraints have reasonably predictable shadow costs based on underlying technology trends. And so one reference point for emission pricing is the present value of the shadow cost of binding net zero emission constraints. And this way of calibrating emission pricing is transparent. It has a clearly understood origin. It aligns clearly with your long-run climate goals, and it also aligns well and creates an exit from any market-creating industrial policies that have been advanced and deployed. And it's also important to recognize that it's possible to calibrate emission pricing that's rooted in the shadow costs of binding net zero emission constraints and can be differentiated across easy and hard to decarbonize sectors. And I argue that there are both efficiency reasons for doing that. And the simple efficiency argument is, do you really think about running the shadow cost of removing emissions from airplanes and running it through the power sector, which will be easier to decarbonize, And also we know that in the long run, the long run shadow cost in the power sector will be relatively low. And at the same time, we want to increase the electrification of the economy. And so it's important to get the whole of the economy to adjust to the right relative price signals. And so all of the capital stock adopts in an efficient way, and that we don't kind of unnecessarily raise and then see the price of power and then see it decline over time, given, and so that's one example of how it can be more efficient to differentiate carbon pricing by sector. And also, this differentiation by sector will also allow at least an important mitigation of some of the adverse distributional effects, as it happens by the nature of the technology advances that we've seen. Many of the customer-facing sectors will be relatively easy to decarbonize with the forecastable advance of technologies in terms of home heating, personal transport, and so forth. And so this differentiated pricing can also be used to help mitigate some of the adverse distributional impacts of emission pricing. The other way of calibrating emission pricing is to kind of more in the mainstream of economics, is to use the social cost of carbon. And the social cost of carbon is essentially derived from integrated assessment models, which model long-run pathways for the economy, the climate damages that arise from cumulative emissions, and the mitigation costs. And the social cost of carbon is essentially that price of carbon which balances the marginal social benefits of avoiding climate damage, the present value of future climate damages versus the current mitigation costs, the social costs of taking climate action. Now, this approach, I would argue, is less transparent. It has, and less readily understood. It has wide uncertainty ranges. That in itself isn't a problem, but it can complicate implementation. And it also rests on value judgments on equity weights around the distributional impacts of societal losses from climate change, and debates on what is the appropriate social discount rate. And of course, this framework for emission pricing only lends itself to an economy-wide approach. It doesn't provide any criteria on sector differentiation. And so you would need economy-wide redistribution mechanisms to deal with the regressive distributional impacts of this approach, be it tax cuts, particularly for low-income households, or carbon dividends, or lump sum transfers. And so what are the choice criteria? I think between these two options, and I think that there are three criteria that point very firmly towards the first option that I set out, and that's, I think the first option provides a much more credible anchor for long-run expectations on the transformation of energy system. I think it can have some efficiency benefits, and as well as impart greater distributional fairness. Now let me just turn to one last point, and then I'll try to, then I'll begin to tie these elements together.
Yeah, I just want to remind our audience that registered participants can pose questions for Stephen by using the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll gather them at the end of Stephen's talk. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So just briefly on the institutional setup for energy markets. And it's important to, and I'll just say a few words about electricity markets. And unlike most markets in the economy, which arise from the spontaneous interaction of producers and consumers. Electricity markets are very much government creations, and they were born out of, or they arose out of the unbundling of vertically integrated electricity utilities, initially in the United Kingdom, then in a number of regions in the US, and then more widely across the world. And these government-created markets are also very carefully designed, and they aim to strike a very careful balancing act between the control of market power in tight markets and the ability of electricity generators to engage in strategic behavior around the availability and dispatch of plants, particularly in tight markets, and the efficient reward to investment in capacity and reliability in the system. And in principle, electricity markets are a bit an exercise in Ramsey pricing or peak load pricing, where much of the returns to investment, the sunk investments in the system, arise from periods of scarcity in the market. Now, that's fine. It's a bit like peak load pricing is a bit like peak tariffs for commuters and paying for the sunk costs in the transport network. But with power prices, there is a concern that in tight markets, which are the key to imparting returns on investment, there are concerns around missing money. And these are essentially concerns that once investments in capacity are made in the system, the governments will act arbitrarily in periods of tight markets to limit power prices. And indeed, a long enduring feature of power markets is the prevalence of long-term power contracts, power purchase agreements and so forth, and that they've long been a feature of wholesale power markets, in part to mitigate some of these policy risks. And more recently, we've seen innovation in electricity market design and policy, which the creation of additional capacity markets to operate alongside wholesale markets. And these capacity markets are essentially designed to take scarcity prices and some scarcity pricing and turn them into fixed and more predictable payments and more certain payments for capacity. And what I would say, the key point that I want to make around these issues is that the credibility of both electricity market design and emissions pricing is fundamentally key to the advance of low carbon power. And indeed, we've seen a prevalence of long-term contracts for low carbon generation capacity as a device to accelerate their deployment in the system, mitigating both of these perceived policy risks. And the last point that I want to make is on power markets is that they're actually carefully designed around the technologies that make up the system, both on the generation side and then on the demand side. And that as the technologies on the system change, so too must the designs of wholesale power markets and related markets for balancing and ancillary services that essentially keep the lights on. So let me just pull these elements together. And I think this survey of the evidence of transforming energy systems so far leads us to a number of important elements for the crafting of energy reform strategies. And indeed, it's fundamentally important to anchor these strategies in clear long-term climate goals, and indeed the value of net zero emission commitments is that they translate those climate goals into terms that are regularly understandable for the transformation of the capital stock. And then the ingredients or the elements of the domestic energy reform strategies that can deliver on these long-run goals include both some of the traditional elements, such as support for R&D, but also support for market creation of low-carbon alternatives. And this policy mix is particularly important in those countries that specialize in innovation and in manufacturing of low-carbon alternatives. We've also seen the very important role that product differentiation can do to help markets deliver more of the change and lessen some of the burden on policy and accelerating transformation. And indeed, the examples that I gave around the automobile sector and the use of product differentiation to bundle decarbonization with other product characteristics has helped to advance these product offerings in markets. The additional element, and so that's really about kickstarting and getting us out of the starting blocks of the process of change, and then using emissions pricing to essentially complete the journey, facilitated by the early stage development of low carbon alternatives, and indeed using emission pricing differentiated by sector to help deal with some of the regressive distributional impacts and without too much of an efficiency penalty, if not an efficiency gain. And also the importance of adapting energy markets and infrastructures to low carbon alternatives. And it's important to sequence these in a coherent and way to build low carbon interest, to build policy credibility, and to create reinforcing mechanisms that help sustain emission pricing over the long run to complete the journey. And of course, it's also important to ensure that distributional impacts are adequately addressed to ease resistance to change. And so let me just conclude that it's kind of the vital point of reference that I want to leave folks with is the vital importance of instilling much higher powered incentives to advance and indeed to accelerate the progression of low carbon alternatives and to hasten the transformation of the capital stock to lead us to our climate goals. So I hope that gives you a sense of the key messages and key points of the book. I want to say that there are two parts of the story that I haven't touched on. One is around material and energy efficiency, and the other is on how you would coordinate these across countries. But this is, and they're dealt with in the book, but this is, in a way, the core element on which the other elements complement and build on. So let me stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I very much look forward to questions and discussion. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephen. In your calm way, you are promoting indeed a heterodox approach. And it is, if we can exit screen, very good. So first, let me just remind people the new book is Transforming Energy Systems, which by Stephen Fries, which has been published by Edward Elgar, as put up by our meetings coordinator, Jessica Parada, on the chat. Elgar is offering a 50% discount in US purchases. In fact, I think global purchases, but we have the link up to the US Elgar website if anyone would like to run out virtually and buy the book. Secondly, just to remind people that participants can post, though this is going out worldwide and is an open live stream, registered participants can post questions on the Q&A function. While our audience gathers itself, let me start with a couple questions to you. You know, your heterodox reform strategy is different from what you or Nick Stern or other colleagues of yours had been promoting a few years ago, and it's definitely different than the economists, the mainstream economists' usual, if we just get the carbon price right, everything will cascade, or the additional version that if we just get the banking supervision right, everything will cascade in a good way. There are others out there who are calling for a real Green New Deal, a lot more public investment and more direct state intervention than what you're calling for. Why do you think your proposal is sufficient, and how do you counter those who are insisting on a much more aggressive public approach?
So I think there are a couple of points that I would make in response to that question. I think that the first point is that the approach that I'm setting out essentially builds on the successes in the acceleration of low carbon alternatives that we've already seen. So we know that the components of the policy framework that I've set out work. And let me just kind of amplify that a little bit and go back and discuss a bit of the evidence around how we got to the point where we are with wind, solar PV, battery electric vehicles. And we know from the patenting data and the correlation of the patenting data with previous oil price shocks that a lot of the initial impetus to the innovations in low carbon innovations and the advance and diffusion through the markets has as their origin past energy price shocks. And since the middle of the 2000s onward, the deployment of market creating policies that have supported the deployment of these alternative technologies. And the proposal that I'm putting forward, or the approach that I'm suggesting, is essentially, rather than relying on energy price shocks to shift the relative prices away from fossil fuels to low carbon alternatives, is to use long-run commitments to net zero emissions, supported and strengthened in terms of their credibility by comprehensive and coherent reform strategies that get us out of the starting blocks in terms of, and help us successfully advance low carbon alternatives in their early stages, and can then accelerate them and use them very efficiently and improve the efficiency or strengthen the efficiency of the approach with emission pricing as these alternatives become more commercial. So the first point that I would make is that my approach is grounded in the experience so far. What hasn't kickstarted the innovation and the advance of alternative technologies so far is emission pricing. And it's not like there is an epistemic barrier to emission pricing. I think economists have been writing about the need to correct the environmental externality for decades. I think and every policymaker and business person that I speak with, I mean, the understanding of that economic point is, I think, well understood. And the other point, I think there's very important issues around cause and effect here. So as you said in your question, Adam, the traditional way economists think about cause and effect in this process is that you correct the externality through emission pricing. That triggers the innovation, and that accelerates the advance of alternatives. But you can easily imagine causation running in the opposite direction as well. They're not mutually exclusive, but from a political economy point, that is, if you make the availability of low carbon alternatives more feasible and more available through other means, it becomes then easier to implement emissions pricing. And indeed, there is some evidence for this reverse causality in the experience so far, in that those countries that have the highest levels of emission pricing in terms of level and sectoral coverage or coverage of emissions actually benefit from legacy low carbon resources in the form of hydroelectric and nuclear resources. And you see this quite clearly in the Nordic countries. And the only country that has really both pioneered low carbon alternatives and had quite high emission pricing really is Denmark, at least in terms of my parsing.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have 4 or 5 questions we want to get to. So could you pace it?
Sorry. So I think a short answer is that I think what I'm proposing is well rooted in the evidence so far, and not just in broad economic principles. And the other point that I would make on the kind of the more decisive interventions and the more kind of direction of what needs to happen is that, and the nature of the problem is that we have to get everyone to change, and we have to attract people to change. And if you, I think, start being more direct or more directive in your approach, you run the risk of taking a more ultimately politically divisive path. And so it may sound like a route to acceleration, but it may not play out that way in practice.
So picking up on that, Whitson Pignatello has a great question on the Q&A. You've chosen to advocate for the reasons you set out, emission pricing by sector. But as we've seen, for example, in trade policy, I'm expanding a bit on this question, and many other subsidies, that you also can have very efficient rent seeking and pursuit of vested interests when you start privileging sectors. So from a political economy perspective, how do you deal with that risk?
I think there are 2 aspects to this. So I think if you think of the political economy aspects of implementing emission pricing, I think the impacts on consumers, I think, are at least have been first and foremost in terms of creating the pushback. But in terms of mitigating rent seeking, I think the key test here is anchoring well your long-run policy goals in net zero emission commitments, and using that as a device for accelerating change and mitigating rent seeking. So the fact that you're differentiating emission pricing by sector doesn't necessarily mean that you're mitigating or you're going easy or soft on your long-run policy goals. And take the example of automobiles, which I think are closest to being to the point of having a commercially viable alternative to the traditional technologies. By having a very aggressive timetable for their decarbonization, so no new fossil fuel vehicles by 2030, and some European countries 2040 more generally, you are not letting up on your long-run decarbonization objectives, and in fact you're pursuing them more aggressively. But the fact that it doesn't necessarily need a high shadow carbon price to get to that endpoint doesn't mean that you're kind of backing off on your ambition or creating opportunities for rent seeking. In that case, you're really using market competition to drive change. Okay, so great. I think, yeah.
So we're about to run over time, but we have a number of questions from viewers and as well from me on this financial sector aspect. A great deal of attention has been paid to the efforts to have central banks take green into account. We've had the statements by various asset managers and asset owners that they're going to take green into account. That didn't seem to feature a big piece in your presentation. Should we take it from that those efforts are all just about show, or maybe they're well-intentioned but are having little impact, or do they directly complement what you're saying? How does this major campaign play out in your view, the financial sector side from central?
So I think the financial sector has a hugely important role to play in all of this. It's the financial sector in the economy in general that brings the future forward in time and confronts it with us now in terms of asset prices. And so I think that the financial sector is absolutely central to this, but I think fixing the problems in the real economy and treating those real economy problems in full and comprehensive way is first and foremost to getting to the solution. And then I think what happens in the financial sector can be a strong and powerful complement to that. And so I think all the initiatives around greater financial transparency on climate opportunities and risks is fundamentally right and well placed. I think that it's absolutely right that financial investors evaluate the risks and opportunities, and that they have the information available to do so. I would then, the one aspect of this that I would pause a bit on is on perhaps overly simplistic taxonomies of what's green and what's not. And I think that making sure that there's full and comprehensive information available is absolutely key. And also, I think having an understanding of the transformational pathways, and so having private companies set out their vision, their pathways for decarbonization of their activities, I think is crucially important. But the one point that I would make on this is that go back to the point that I made on the cumulative nature of and path dependency of knowledge. And what we see is that the important role of technology adjacencies between existing technologies and low carbon alternatives. And I would just say it's important to understand what those adjacencies are and how they could play out in a transforming energy system.
Great. And a final question, and this is prompted by Yanni Zhu on our chat, and it's of course one we at PIE are very concerned with, is the international aspect and the discussion of things like CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the question of developing countries versus developed, the question of Europe moving fast or China and US moving more slowly. I know you've thought deeply about these issues. You touched on it in your presentation, but could you say a bit more about how you see this issue area affecting the kinds of things you were talking about advocating?
So I think the important thing to realize is that part of the energy system, important parts of the energy system, are primarily aimed at producing non-tradable energy. So most electric power is not traded across borders. And most services, most of the energy services in buildings and in transport leaving international aviation, shipping off to one side. So these are all domestic activities, and indeed they can be, there's a case for international coordination of their decarbonization. But the issue of carbon border adjustments and international trade is primarily an issue around, in terms of decarbonization, is primarily an issue around heavy industry materials, iron and steel, to a lesser extent cement, which isn't internationally traded, but other metals and other energy and emission intensive materials, and in products that are made from these relatively emission intensive materials is where the trade issues come mostly into play. And also in my book, this is the one area of the economy where emission pricing is going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting and work, because the decarbonization costs are relatively high in these sectors. And in that context, I think it's important either that countries move quickly to align their emission pricing, particularly in the industrial sectors, either they cooperate in aligning, or you go down a route in which I think there could be a role for carbon border adjustments, particularly in a transition pathway that that might ultimately lead to an expansion of carbon pricing, appropriate carbon pricing across countries. So I think it's primarily an issue around the industrial sector and trade in emission-intensive goods, and in some products that are that use those emission-intensive materials significantly, like automobiles, for example.
Great. Well, thank you to our audience, and thank you especially, of course, to Dr. Stephen Fries. Congratulations on his new book, Transforming Energy Systems, released by Edward Elgar, and to remind again, available through the end of the month at a discount. We will put the link on our webpage for the event, and welcoming you back to the Peterson Institute in your new capacity. We look forward to working with you and developing with you and conversing about your heterodox policies to get us from here to net zero emissions.
Thanks so much, Adam, and thanks everyone for their kind attention. So thanks again. Take care now.
Meeting is adjourned.